execution site stood silent as the crowd gathered, their murmurs hushed by the grim spectacle before them. A man, bound by ropes, was hoisted onto a wooden structure, not a traditional cross, but one shaped like an axe. His face, weathered by years of travel and hardship, showed no fear. He had walked this path willingly. But why had Andrew, the quiet and steadfast disciple, met such a fate? What had led him to this moment, condemned by a ruthless empire? Who was Andrew before he became an apostle? Why was his execution so different from the others? Though he was overshadowed by his brother Peter in biblical accounts, Andrew's journey was one of unwavering faith. From the shores of Galilee to the distant lands he evangelized, his dedication never wavered. And now, in this final moment, his silence spoke louder than words. Long before he found himself facing death, Andrew had been a simple fisherman. Born in Bethsaida, he spent his early years casting nets alongside his brother Simon, later known as Peter. The sea was his world, its rhythm shaping his days. But everything changed when he encountered John the Baptist. Unlike the others, who hesitated to follow the voice in the wilderness, Andrew was drawn to his message. He was among the first to recognize that something greater was coming. It was Andrew who first heard John declare, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And it was Andrew who, without hesitation, followed Jesus. While others needed time, Andrew needed none. His heart already knew. He ran to his brother, Peter, and spoke the words that would alter both of their lives forever. "We have found the Messiah." Before we continue, take a moment to support this journey through history. If you're finding this story compelling, leave a like to help this content reach more people. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes, and comment below which biblical figure you'd like to see in a future series. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive. But this story is not about how he found Christ. It is about what happened after, about the years he spent spreading the message of salvation, carrying the truth to distant lands, and the enemies he made along the way. And, most importantly, it is about the moment when his faith was put to the ultimate test. Tied to the X-shaped cross, Andrew did not cry out in pain. He did not beg for mercy. Instead, he did something that left the crowd speechless. He smiled. His executioners had expected screams, but what they witnessed was a man embracing his fate. This was not a man who feared death. This was a man who had already conquered it. The Roman governor stood at a distance, watching as Andrew's body hung from the X-shaped cross. Unlike the brutal executions that Rome was known for, Andrew's death was different. There were no nails driven through his hands, no sudden, violent end. Instead, he was bound by thick ropes, left to suffer a slow, agonizing death. The crowd expected cries of pain, but there were none. Instead, Andrew's lips moved in silent prayer. His face, though pale from exhaustion, bore no fear, only peace. But how did he get here? What had led this quiet and steadfast man to this moment of ultimate sacrifice? After Jesus' ascension, Andrew did not stay in the familiar lands of Galilee. While Peter and Paul became central figures in Rome, Andrew's mission led him far beyond the heart of the empire. He traveled eastward, carrying the message of Christ to distant lands, preaching in Greece, Asia Minor, and as far as the lands beyond the Black Sea. Some accounts even suggest that he reached the borders of present-day Russia, bringing the gospel to those who had never heard it before. Unlike the fiery speeches of Paul or the commanding presence of Peter, Andrew's approach was different. He was a quiet persuader, a man whose faith spoke louder than his words. He built communities, strengthened believers, and worked in silence, never seeking recognition. But faith, especially in an empire that worshipped its rulers as gods, was dangerous. In the city of Patras, Greece, Andrew's teachings caught the attention of the Roman authorities. The governor, Egetes, saw Christianity as a direct challenge to Rome's power. Andrew was arrested, beaten, and given a choice: renounce Christ or face death. But Andrew, the man who had followed Jesus from the beginning, did not waver. He stood before the governor, battered but unbroken, and spoke words that would seal his fate. "I will never deny my Lord. I do not fear the cross, for it is through the cross that I gain life." His sentence was decided. He would be crucified, but not in the manner of Christ. To prolong his suffering, he would be tied, not nailed, to a cross shaped like an X. There he would hang for days, his strength slowly fading, his body failing, but his spirit unshaken. And so, Andrew was led to the place of execution. The ropes tightened around his wrists, his feet left dangling in the air. The crowd watched, waiting for the moment when suffering would break him. But instead of curses, they heard something else. A voice, steady, unwavering, praying for those who had condemned him. The crowd stood in stunned silence as Andrew's voice carried through the air. Bound to the X-shaped cross, his body strained against the ropes, yet there was no plea for mercy. No curses, no desperate cries, only prayer. Even the Roman guards, hardened by countless executions, shifted uneasily. They had seen men die in agony, screaming and cursing their fate. But Andrew, he did not fight. He did not resist. Instead, he welcomed the cross. Among those watching was a woman, Maximilla, the wife of the Roman governor Egetes. Unlike her husband, she had listened to Andrew's teachings, and something in his words had stirred her soul. She had come in secret to hear him preach, and what she heard was unlike anything she had ever known. Now, as she watched him hang from the cross, a realization settled deep in her heart. This was not an ordinary man. The Roman governor, however, felt no such sympathy. Egetes had ordered Andrew's execution to demonstrate his authority, to remind the people of Patras that no faith could stand against Rome. But instead of fear, he saw something else in the crowd: admiration. Some whispered prayers, others wept openly. Even as Andrew's body weakened, his spirit only seemed to grow stronger. The governor clenched his fists. He could not let this man become a symbol of defiance. Yet Andrew, despite his suffering, spoke, not words of anger, but of peace. "Do not mourn for me, but rejoice, for this cross is not a punishment, but a gift. Through it, I will see my Lord." His words spread like wildfire, reaching even those who had doubted him. Maximilla, overwhelmed by what she had witnessed, made a decision that would change everything. She turned from the execution site, her heart set on one thing. She would confront her husband. She would beg him to spare this man. But time was running out, and Andrew's fate was already sealed. The crowd stood in stunned silence as Andrew's voice carried through the air. Bound to the X-shaped cross, his body strained against the ropes, yet there was no plea for mercy. No curses, no desperate cries. Only prayer. Even the Roman guards, hardened by countless executions, shifted uneasily. They had seen men die in agony, screaming and cursing their fate. But Andrew, he did not fight. He did not resist. Instead, he welcomed the cross. Among those watching was a woman, Maximilla, the wife of the Roman governor Egetes. Unlike her husband, she had listened to Andrew's teachings, and something in his words had stirred her soul. She had come in secret to hear him preach, and what she heard was unlike anything she had ever known. Now, as she watched him hang from the cross, a realization settled deep in her heart. This was not an ordinary man. The Roman governor, however, felt no such sympathy. Egetes had ordered Andrew's execution to demonstrate his authority, to remind the people of Patras that no faith could stand against Rome. But instead of fear, he saw something else in the crowd: admiration. Some whispered prayers, others wept openly. Even as Andrew's body weakened, his spirit only seemed to grow stronger. The governor clenched his fists. He could not let this man become a symbol of defiance. Yet Andrew, despite his suffering, spoke. Not words of anger, but of peace. "Do not mourn for me, but rejoice. For this cross is not a punishment, but a gift. Through it, I will see my Lord." His words spread like wildfire, reaching even those who had doubted him. Maximilla, overwhelmed by what she had witnessed, made a decision that would change everything. She turned from the execution site, her heart set on one thing: she would confront her husband. She would beg him to spare this man. But time was running out, and Andrew's fate was already sealed. Maximilla rushed through the corridors of the governor's palace, her heart pounding. She had remained silent for too long, watching from the shadows as her husband, Egetes, carried out his ruthless rule. But Andrew's words had shaken something deep within her. This was not just another execution. This was an injustice, a crime against a man whose only offense was his faith. Bursting into the governor's chambers, she found Egetes seated at his desk, his expression darkened by frustration. He had received reports from the execution site, reports that disturbed him. "The people do not fear," one of his advisors had told him. "They are not celebrating his death. They are watching in reverence." Now, as Maximilla stood before him, her voice trembled with urgency. "You must release him," she pleaded. "Andrew is no criminal. He has harmed no one." Egetes' face hardened. "I have given my orders," he said coldly. "The man refuses to renounce his God. He challenges the authority of Rome. His death is necessary." Maximilla took a step closer, her eyes filled with desperation. "Look at what is happening. Even as he suffers, he does not curse you. He does not resist. Does that not tell you something? Have you ever seen a man embrace death as he does?" Egetes stood abruptly, his patience wearing thin. "Enough," he snapped. "You speak like one of his followers. Have his words poisoned your mind as well?" She met his glare without flinching. "His words have opened my eyes." Silence fell between them, thick with unspoken tension. Maximilla knew she was risking everything: her status, her safety, perhaps even her life. But she could not ignore the truth any longer. "Listen to the people," she urged. "They see what you refuse to see. He is not dying in shame. He is dying in glory." Egetes clenched his jaw, his mind battling between pride and uncertainty. He had expected Andrew's execution to serve as a warning, a demonstration of Rome's unyielding power. But instead, it had become something else, a spectacle of faith that even his own wife could not ignore. A shadow of doubt crept into his thoughts. Had he made a mistake? Outside, the crowd remained fixed on the man upon the cross. His body weakened, his breaths grew shallow, but his spirit remained unbroken. Andrew was slipping away, and the governor had to decide. Would he let this man die, or would he do the unthinkable? The sun had begun its slow descent over the city of Patras, casting long shadows over the execution site. Andrew's body, bound to the X-shaped cross, hung motionless. His skin was pale, his breath shallow, but his lips still moved in silent prayer. The crowd remained. They had expected to witness a slow, painful death, another public display of Roman power. But what they saw instead unsettled them. Andrew's suffering was undeniable, yet there was no fear in his eyes, no desperation, only a quiet acceptance that defied everything they had been taught about death. A messenger hurried toward the governor's palace, his footsteps urgent against the stone pavement. Egeats had to make a decision. Now. Inside, the governor stood in silence, his thoughts consumed by his wife's plea. Maximilla had never spoken against him before. She had never questioned his rule, nor his punishments. But today, she had defied him. And she was not alone. Word had spread through the streets. The people were not celebrating Andrew's death. They were mourning it. Some were whispering that he was a holy man, that his God was greater than Rome itself. Others had begun to question the very laws that had condemned him. The door burst open and a soldier entered, his face tense. "Governor," he said breathlessly, "the people grow restless. They are demanding his release." Egeats' eyes narrowed. Demanding? The soldier hesitated. They believe he is innocent, that he should not die. Egeats turned to his advisors. Some exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen what happened when a ruler ignored the will of the people. Revolts had started over far less. Maximilla stepped forward again. "You must release him," she repeated. "If not for him, then for your own sake. If he dies, his death will not be forgotten." Egeats exhaled sharply, running a hand through his beard. This was not how it was supposed to go. Andrew was supposed to be an example, a warning. But instead, he had become something far more dangerous. A symbol of faith, of resistance, of a power even Rome could not break. Finally, the governor gave a sharp nod. "Send the order," he commanded. "Cut him down." The soldier hesitated as if uncertain he had heard correctly. "You wish to spare him?" Egeats' eyes were cold. "Before this city turns against me." "Yes. Do it now." The soldier did not wait for another word. He turned and sprinted toward the execution site. The order had been given. But was it too late? The execution site was eerily quiet as the Roman soldier pushed through the gathered crowd, his heart pounding. The governor's command echoed in his mind. "Cut him down." He had never received an order like this before. An execution reversed. A man spared at the last moment. Would he even make it in time? The people watched anxiously as Andrew's body remained suspended on the X-shaped cross, his head tilted forward, his breaths shallow. His hands, bound tightly by ropes, had lost all strength. He had been hanging for hours, and though he had not been nailed, his suffering was immense. The soldier rushed toward the executioners standing nearby. "By order of the governor, release him." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Had the Roman governor changed his mind? Had he recognized the injustice of this execution? The murmurs grew louder, some voices crying out in relief, others in confusion. But as the guards moved toward Andrew's cross, a sudden sound stopped them. A voice, weak but firm. "Do not take me down." The guards froze. The crowd fell silent. Andrew slowly lifted his head, his eyes filled not with pain, but with peace. He had heard the order. He knew they were trying to spare his life, but he did not want to be saved. "I have long desired this moment," he whispered, "to suffer as my Lord suffered. I do not wish to escape it now." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. The governor's order had been clear, but so was Andrew's refusal. Maximilla, who had pushed her way through the crowd, fell to her knees, tears in her eyes. "Please," she begged, "let them take you down. You have done enough. You do not need to die." Andrew turned his gaze toward her, a faint smile on his lips. "It is not death I fear. I do not leave this world. I go to my Lord." The soldier hesitated. He had seen men fight desperately for their lives, scream in agony, plead for mercy. But this man, he was embracing death. The order had come too late. Andrew's breathing slowed, his voice barely a whisper. "Lord, receive me." Then, as the golden light of the setting sun bathed his frail form, his head bowed. His final breath left him. The crowd stood in stunned silence. The man they had come to witness suffer had left this world not in despair, but in victory. Even in death, he had defied Rome, not with rebellion, but with faith. Maximilla wept. The guards, once so sure of their duty, now felt the weight of what they had done. Even the soldier who had brought the governor's command remained motionless, staring at the lifeless body of the apostle. Andrew was gone, but his name, his story, and his faith would never be forgotten. The golden hues of the setting sun cast long shadows over the execution site as the crowd remained frozen, their eyes fixed on Andrew's lifeless body. His head rested against his chest, his arms stretched outward on the X-shaped cross. But there was no agony in his expression, only peace. He had embraced death, not with fear, but with the certainty of what lay beyond it. Maximilla wiped the tears from her face, her hands trembling. She had fought for his release, had pleaded with her husband to spare him, but Andrew had refused salvation, not because he sought suffering, but because he had already found something greater. The Roman guards hesitated. They had received orders to take him down, but now there was no need. Their duty was complete, but for the first time they felt no sense of victory. They had witnessed countless executions, yet none had been like this. The people in the crowd began to murmur. Some whispered prayers, others simply stood in silence as if realizing they had witnessed something more than just a death. They had witnessed a testimony, one that could not be silenced by ropes or crosses. Maximilla turned toward the soldier who had delivered the governor's order. "Let us take him down," she pleaded. "Let us give him a proper burial." The soldier hesitated. "The governor ordered his release," he said, his voice low. But it was too late. Now, what happens to his body is no longer my decision. Another voice broke through the stillness, this time from a man in the crowd. "Then let it be ours." One by one, men and women stepped forward, no longer hiding their devotion. Some had followed Andrew in secret, afraid of Rome's wrath. Others had only just begun to understand the depth of his faith. But now, standing before his cross, none of them could remain silent. The executioners exchanged uneasy glances. If the people took Andrew's body, they would be defying Roman authority. But how could they stop them? The crowd was no longer fearful. The man they had crucified had planted something deep within their hearts, a fire that Rome would struggle to extinguish. With careful hands, Maximilla and a group of believers untied the ropes that bound Andrew's body. As they lowered him from the cross, the weight of his sacrifice became real to them. He was gone, but his mission was not. They wrapped him in cloth, preparing his body as was custom. They did not yet know where they would bury him, but they knew one thing for certain: his story would not end here. In the distance, beyond the city walls, the winds carried whispers of a truth that no empire could destroy. Andrew had died. But his faith had only just begun to rise. The night had fallen over Patras, but the city was far from asleep. The events of the day weighed heavily on those who had witnessed Andrew's final moments. Word had already begun to spread. Whispers of a man who had embraced death with peace, of an execution that had not silenced faith but strengthened it. In the shadows, a small group of believers carried Andrew's body through the darkened streets. They moved with caution, knowing that Rome's watchful eyes were everywhere. The governor might have ordered his release at the last moment, but that did not mean the danger had passed. Maximilla led them, her veil pulled over her face to conceal her identity. She had risked everything for this moment, and she knew there was no turning back. One of the men walking beside her spoke in a hushed tone. "Where will we bury him?" She did not answer immediately. She had thought about this ever since Andrew took his final breath. He could not be buried in the official Roman cemeteries, not when he had been condemned as an enemy of the empire. But they could not simply leave him in an unmarked grave. His life, his sacrifice, deserved more than that. Finally, she spoke. "There is a place outside the city, a garden hidden from the roads. He will rest there." The others nodded. It was not a grand tomb, not a place of honor in the eyes of Rome. But to those who followed Andrew's teachings, it would become something sacred. They reached the secluded garden just before dawn. The air was still, the sky painted in soft shades of purple and blue. In the silence, they dug the earth, their hands working quickly but gently as if handling something more precious than gold. As they laid Andrew's body into the ground, Maximilla knelt beside him, pressing her hand against the linen cloth that covered him. "You have finished your race," she whispered, "but we will carry on." One by one, the others stepped forward, offering prayers, their voices quiet but filled with conviction. They were no longer just followers. They were now the ones who would continue Andrew's mission. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon as they sealed the grave. They knew they could not stay much longer. Soon, the city would awaken, and questions would be asked. But before they left, Maximilla turned to the group and spoke the words that would be remembered for generations. "This is not just a burial," she said. "This is the beginning." As they disappeared into the city's alleys, a new truth settled in their hearts. Andrew was gone. But the faith he had carried, the faith he had died for, was only beginning to take root. The sun rose over Patras, casting a golden glow over the city that had just witnessed the death of one of Christ's closest disciples. The streets, which had been filled with whispers the night before, now bustled with merchants, soldiers, and common citizens who went about their daily routines. But among them, there was a growing tension. Something had changed. Andrew's execution had not gone as expected. The Romans had intended to make an example of him, to strike fear into the hearts of those who followed the teachings of Christ. Instead, they had done the opposite. People who had once doubted his message now spoke of him with reverence. Those who had hesitated in their faith now stood firm. Maximilla remained hidden in her home, her heart still heavy from the events of the night before. She had risked everything to ensure Andrew was buried with dignity, and now she waited, wondering if the governor, her own husband, would seek vengeance for her defiance. Aegeates, however, had not left his chambers since the order to release Andrew had come too late. He had not spoken of it, nor had he addressed the murmurs spreading through the city. But the weight of his decision pressed upon him. When he had sentenced Andrew to death, he had expected another public display of Rome's dominance. Instead, he had witnessed something he could not explain. Andrew had not fought, had not begged, had not resisted. He had welcomed death. And worse, the people had seen it too. A knock at his chamber door pulled him from his thoughts. One of his advisors entered, bowing slightly before speaking. "My lord," the man hesitated as if weighing his words. "The people speak of Andrew. They say his death was different." Aegeates frowned. "Different?" The advisor nodded. "There is talk that he was holy, that he did not die in shame, but in victory." The governor's jaw tightened. He had seen this before, the way men became legends after death. He had executed Andrew to weaken the Christians. Yet now, he had only made him a martyr. Maximilla's words from the night before echoed in his mind. If he dies, his death will not be forgotten. He had dismissed her then. Now he wasn't so sure. Outside, in the hidden corners of the city, Andrew's followers gathered in secret. They did not mourn as those who had lost everything. They mourned as those who had gained something far greater, because they knew the truth. Andrew was dead, but his mission was just beginning. The whispers about Andrew's death did not fade. Instead, they spread like wildfire through the streets of Patras. In the marketplaces, in the homes of the wealthy, even among the servants in the governor's palace, people spoke of what had happened. Some said Andrew's face had shone with peace even as he hung on the X-shaped cross. Others claimed that, in his final moments, he had seen something beyond this world, something that made him embrace death rather than fear it. Maximilla watched as the city slowly changed. She had been one of the few who truly knew Andrew, who had sat at his feet and listened as he spoke of Christ. She had tried to save him, but he had refused. Now she understood why. His mission had never been about survival. It had always been about faith. Meanwhile, Governor Ajits could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. He had expected Andrew's death to silence the movement. Instead, it had given it strength. Even his own household was not immune. Maximilla had not spoken to him since the execution, and when she did, her words cut deeper than any sword. "You thought you were killing a man," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "But you have only made him a legend." Ajits clenched his fists, frustration boiling beneath the surface. "He was just a fisherman," he spat. "A man like any other. Nothing more." Maximilla shook her head. "No," she said. "He was more. And deep down, you know it." Her words haunted him. He had ruled with power, with force, with absolute control. Yet this man, this quiet, humble preacher, had left an impact he could not erase. In the days that followed, Ajit's torment grew. Everywhere he went, he heard Andrew's name. He saw the faith in the eyes of the people, the way they no longer feared Rome's punishment. One evening, as he walked through the palace corridors, he overheard two servants whispering. "They say the earth shook when he died," one murmured, "that the sky darkened as if the heavens mourned for him." Ajits felt his chest tighten. He had seen many men die, but none had left an echo like this. He had sentenced Andrew to death to prove Rome's dominance, but now he feared he had only proven something else. That Andrew's God was greater than Rome itself. Governor Ajits could no longer find peace. Andrew's death should have been a fleeting moment, a name soon forgotten in the long list of those Rome had crushed. Yet, no matter where he turned, he could not escape the growing presence of the man he had condemned. The people whispered of miracles. Some claimed that those who had prayed at Andrew's grave had been healed. Others said they had seen visions, as if the apostle still walked among them, guiding them even in death. Maximilla watched her husband's torment in silence. He had been so sure of his power, so convinced that Rome was unshakable. But now she saw the fear in his eyes. Not fear of rebellion, nor of the people, but of something he could not understand. One evening, as she entered his chambers, she found him staring at his reflection in a bronze mirror, his face weary, his hands trembling. "You cannot escape it, can you?" she asked softly. Ajits exhaled sharply. "Escape what?" he snapped, though they both knew the answer. "The truth," Maximilla said. "You saw it, just as I did. Andrew was not like the others. He did not beg for his life. He did not curse his executioners. He met death with peace. And now, look around you. His name has not faded. It has grown. Ajit turned away, his jaw clenched. He did not want to hear it. He wanted to believe that Andrew had been nothing more than a man, that his death was just another punishment, another example of Rome's control. But deep down, he knew. He had seen Andrew's face in those final moments, had witnessed something he could not explain. The quiet confidence, the unwavering faith. Even as death closed in, Andrew had looked beyond this world. And now, Ajit was haunted by the thought, what if he had been wrong? What if Andrew's God was real? The weight of that possibility crushed him. Rome's power was vast, its legions unmatched, its rulers worshipped as gods. But Andrew had not feared any of it, because he had believed in something greater. Maximilla stepped forward, her voice softer now. "It is not too late," she said. "You do not have to fight the truth." But Ajit only shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I cannot undo what I have done," he whispered. He turned toward the window, staring out at the city of Patras, where the name of Andrew continued to spread. He had thought himself the master of life and death. But now he realized he had no power at all. Governor Ajit was no longer the man he once was. He had ruled with authority, believing in the absolute power of Rome. But since the execution of Andrew, something had changed. The world around him felt different. Or perhaps it was he who had changed. The streets of Patras buzzed with quiet defiance. The followers of Andrew were not afraid. In secret, they gathered, they prayed. They spoke his name with reverence, as if he had not truly died but had only stepped beyond this world. Maximilla had withdrawn completely from the life of the palace. She no longer attended the gatherings of the Roman elite. She no longer entertained the guests of her husband. She had given herself to something greater, something that Ajit could not understand. Or perhaps he refused to understand it. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered through the halls of his estate, his mind restless. The silence of the night was deafening. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Andrew's face, not filled with terror, not twisted with pain, but calm, as if he had welcomed death. Why? Why had Andrew not feared him? Why had he not begged for mercy? Why had he not cursed Rome, cursed its rulers, cursed the men who had bound him to that cross? Because he had believed. Ajit stopped, gripping the stone wall for support. He had spent his life commanding men, deciding their fates. But never before had he questioned himself like this. Maximilla's voice echoed in his mind. "You thought you were killing a man, but you have only made him a legend." The thought was unbearable. He had tried to silence Andrew, but now his name was spoken more than ever. He had tried to end a movement, but now it was growing beyond his control. Ajit closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. The empire he had devoted his life to, the authority he had believed to be absolute, none of it had been enough to stop one man from changing the world. And deep down, a terrifying realization began to form in his heart. Perhaps Andrew had been right. Perhaps the power of Rome was nothing compared to the power of faith. Ajit's breath came heavy, his hands trembling. He did not know what to do. He had spent his entire life fighting for control, but now, for the first time, he realized he had none. The weight of his actions consumed Governor Ajit. The more he tried to push Andrew's execution from his mind, the more it haunted him. Rome had crucified thousands, yet none of those deaths had left a scar on his soul like this one. Days passed, but the unrest in Patras did not fade. The people whispered Andrew's name, not in fear, but in reverence. Even those who had once mocked his teachings now spoke of him with curiosity, as if his death had confirmed what his life had already proclaimed, that there was a truth greater than Rome, a power beyond the reach of emperors. Agit's own household had changed. Maximilla, his wife, no longer looked at him with the same respect. She was not openly defiant, but the distance between them had grown. She no longer lived under the authority of Rome. She lived under a faith that he could not break. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Agit walked alone through the governor's palace. His feet carried him to the balcony that overlooked the streets of Patras. From there, he could see the people moving, living, carrying on. But he could also see something else. Groups of believers gathered in secret, slipping into homes and hidden courtyards. He knew what they were doing. They were praying. They were remembering Andrew. They were speaking his name. He clenched his fists. He had executed a man to silence him, yet his name was now louder than before. His advisors had warned him, "If this continues, the city will no longer fear you." But was it fear that held power, or was it faith? For the first time in his life, Agit felt something foreign creeping into his heart. Doubt. Doubt in Rome. Doubt in its laws. Doubt in its so-called gods. The empire he had served his entire life had sentenced a righteous man to death. And for what? Because he refused to deny his God? Agit gritted his teeth. He had always believed Rome was invincible, that its power could not be challenged. But Andrew had challenged it. Not with rebellion, not with an army, but with the simple, unwavering belief that there was something greater. And now, Agit feared that belief was spreading. No, he knew it was, because he could feel it within himself. And it terrified him. The walls of the governor's palace, once a fortress of power, now felt like a prison. Governor Agit had spent years ruling with confidence, believing in the might of Rome, in its laws, in its gods. But now those beliefs were unraveling, slipping through his fingers like sand. Everywhere he turned, he saw reminders of Andrew. The people spoke his name in hushed voices, but not with fear, with devotion. His execution was meant to be a warning, a symbol of Rome's unshakable rule. Instead, it had become a rallying cry. Maximilla had not spoken to him in days. When she passed him in the halls, there was no hatred in her eyes, only sorrow. Sorrow for him. She had found peace in Andrew's message, while he had been left with only guilt. Agit knew he was losing control, but he could not understand why. He had followed the law. He had done what any Roman governor would have done. And yet, something deep within him refused to be at peace. Late one night, unable to sleep, he left the palace alone. He walked through the streets of Patras, avoiding the eyes of the people. He did not want to be recognized, not as the man who had condemned Andrew, not as the ruler who had failed to break him. His feet carried him to the outskirts of the city, to a small secluded garden. He did not know why he had come here, but as he stepped forward, his breath caught in his throat. It was Andrew's grave. The earth was fresh, the site unmarked, but Agit knew. He could feel it. This was where they had laid him to rest. He stood there for a long time, staring at the place where the man he had sentenced now lay. The man who had looked him in the eye and refused to deny his faith. The man who had welcomed death rather than betray what he believed. Agit fell to his knees. The weight was too much, the burden too great. He had sentenced many men to death before, but none had left an emptiness in his soul like this. He clenched his fists, his mind screaming against the realization that was clawing its way into his heart. Andrew had won. not in life, not in rebellion, not with force, but in death. And Aegeates knew that no matter what Rome did, no matter how many they tried to silence, the faith Andrew carried would not die. It would only grow. Tears burned in his eyes, but he did not wipe them away. For the first time in his life, Governor Aegeates, the ruler, the judge, the executioner, felt powerless. He had spent his life serving Rome, but deep down he now feared that he had killed a man of the true God. The night air was thick with silence as Governor Aegeates remained on his knees before Andrew's grave. He had come here without knowing why, but now he understood. His soul was searching for something it could not find in Rome's power, its laws, or its gods. His entire life had been devoted to the empire, enforcing its will, punishing those who defied it. He had never questioned it before, until now, until Andrew. His fingers clenched the damp earth as he whispered, "Why?" The wind rustled through the trees, but there was no answer. Yet deep inside, he already knew. Andrew had not died in shame. He had died in victory. Aegeates had sentenced him to death, believing that the cross would end his influence. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had made him greater in death than he had ever been in life. The people of Patras no longer feared Rome. They believed in something greater, something that could not be crucified or buried. A weight pressed down on his chest. What had he done? Maximilla's words returned to him, soft but unshakable. "You thought you were killing a man, but you have only made him a legend." She had been right. He had tried to silence a fisherman, but instead, he had given him immortality. Aegeates staggered to his feet, his mind spinning. He had always believed that Rome was eternal, that its power was absolute. But now, for the first time, he doubted. Could an empire truly stand against something like this? Against a faith that welcomed suffering, that grew stronger in the face of death? His heart pounded as he turned away from the grave. He needed to return to the palace, needed to clear his thoughts. But no matter how far he walked, one thought followed him. Andrew had not been defeated. He had been set free. And deep down, Governor Aegeates feared that he himself was the one who had been condemned. You've just finished Chapter 2 of our 12-part series on the deaths of the apostles. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure to like, subscribe, and share to support this content. Next, in Chapter 3, we reveal the martyrdom of James, son of Zebedee, and how he became the first apostle to be executed for his faith. Don't miss it.